In today's video, we're going to create a new pot prop, and we're also going to create a modular node that we can use to make objects pick-upable and throwable, just like that. And it'll be easy to reuse even on our plants. So stay tuned. Hi, my name is Michael. Welcome to my 2D action and adventure RPG tutorial series. Follow along and learn how to create your own ARPG in Godot 4 using GD Script. All right, so getting into this, here's what we want to create for this pickup and throwable object, right? We want to create a modular node that we can drop on just about anything, hopefully, and make that object so that the player can pick it up and throw it. So that means that there's a few requirements. It must be modular. It must be reusable. The player will need to have some lift and carry states so that we have a way to, present that. And in fact, we could add that the, player can, in my case, let's add a 2A. Player can walk while carrying object. Okay. And throwables should be able to damage the enemies, which I think is probably somewhat obvious, but that's one of the requirements we're going to hit today. And then also the player would drop the throwable object when they take damage. Okay. So let's get started. I mean, I've got my player scene open here, but what I want to do right now is just the usual. Let's do some setup. So we've got our props folder. We've had plants in the past. I'm going to create a new folder for our pot, or you could call it pots, either way. And then we're actually pretty good there. If we look at our sprites, though, we've got this props sprite, okay, and it just has, well, you can't see that too well, but it's just got the plant. So we need to grab our new pot sprite, which is part of the zip file for player updates. So grab that from the HIO page if you need that, or if you've got your own sprite sheet that you want to use for the pot, you can. So let me just go ahead and minimize this again real quick, and we'll open this folder in the Explorer or File Manager. Okay, so now we've got the location of that sprite sheet. Then let's open up that zip file or extract the zip file, and we're going to grab the new props PNG from that. So I've got that already in a downloads folder extracted. So here we go. Here's the player updates file. I'm going to just go into sprites, find props. I'll copy and paste that here. Yep, go ahead and replace that. Now there is also within this, there's some audio files. In a previous video where we did the charge attack, you should have grabbed all of these audio files for the player. There's one in here for the pot destroy that you may not have grabbed. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to come over here to my pot folder, and I'll just paste it right there, just like that. Okay, so that's all the files that we're going to need. If you've got the updated player sprite, which I guess I didn't mention, that was also in the last two videos, so you may want to grab that. That's also here in that player update zip file. There's a new player sprite. Okay, so if we look at this one, you can see in this file we've got some animations for lifting objects and carrying objects. Okay, so you'll need to have that as well. Or again, if you've got your own sprite sheet, your own sprites, then go ahead and generate those as needed. And once we get all those things in place, then we're ready to begin. All right, so now that we're here, we've got this pot folder. Let's create our scene for our pot. So we'll create a new scene. And it's fine if this is a node 2D. That's what I'm going to make mine. It's just going to be a node that kind of holds all the items that we need. Obviously, we're going to want a sprite for our pot. So let's go ahead and add a sprite 2D. And let's see, just grab that texture from the props texture. Okay. And so you can see here, within this sprite, we've got a pot as well as some frames for the pot breaking. And this sprite, in order to configure it properly, we'll just go to the Sprite 2D animation settings, and it's 16 horizontal frames and then 3 vertical frames. And then the default frame is frame 4. Okay, so that's the pot just sitting by itself. We should go ahead and drag this. We've got our origin, our center. Remember, this is kind of where we're going to consider the bottom of the object, and this is going to be important when it comes to things like the Y sorting. So I'm going to just drag this pot up just a little bit so that we've got maybe 2 pixels down below the center, and then everything else is above the center. So that way, if the player walks up to this level, he'll be behind the pot. That'll be obvious when we get in there, but let's go ahead and also add another sprite 2D to our scene. And I'm going to rename this one to sprite 2D _ shadow. And man, we're going to use this for a shadow. And we could use the shadow texture we've used in the past. let's go ahead and just create a gradient texture 2D for this. I don't know why it turns purple at first. That seems like a new issue, but let's go ahead and adjust this gradient. So I think a black is a good starting point, but to end, we'll pick black with no alpha, so it's just completely transparent. And then we need to change our fill setting from linear to radial. And of course, we also need to adjust the settings for this radial. So for a shadow, we need it to start at 0.5, 0.5, so it's in the center. And it needs to go to 1 and 0.5, something like that, okay? So that way it goes to the extents of the box. And then we can also change the width and height of this. We don't need it to be any larger than is required. It just is a waste of memory at that point. But I'm gonna go ahead and give it a width of 20 pixels and height of 12. So there we go. We've got a little shadow like that. And it's in a pretty good spot being just dead center like that, but we should put it behind our Sprite 2D. And we're good to go with that. Of course, we're going to need an animation player. And we're going to need, let's add a static body. Static body 2D, not under the animation player, but under the general pot. So the static body 2D will be the collision shape so that we can't walk through the pot while it's sitting on the ground. And of course that needs a collision shape underneath it. And I'll just set this collision shape to be a box or a rectangle. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to decrease the opacity so I just see the border of that. And I'm going to set the size to 8 by 16. Maybe I meant 16 by 8. There we go. So a little box. And then let's go back to our static body 2D, and we need to set the collision values properly. And what we want it to be on the wall layer. I was going to call it ground because, if I'm doing a platformer, I usually call that one ground. Okay, so it's on layer 5, and it doesn't need to have any layer masks because all this is going to do is just occlude and prevent the player from walking through it. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's open up one of our levels, and I'm going to just open up level 2, which is where from area 1. This is where I kind of test a lot of things, my NPCs and whatnot. And I'm just going to go Shift Control A and add a pot. Here we go. So I'm just going to drag this pot onto this nice little circle of dirt that seems like a fitting location for it. And so if we run the game, we should have a pot. Let's just make sure that it works, like we can see it, and it's preventing us from walking through it. So everything's good. And we can see the players going in front and behind it in an appropriate fashion because of how we've positioned that Sprite 2D. Okay, so far, so good. We've got a pot, it's in a scene. We don't need this pot to do anything super special. In fact, we're not even going to add a script to the pot. It's just going to be this scene that contains these. And because we're building the throwable functionality as a modular component that will drop in, that's going to contain pretty much all of the script that we're going to need for this. But we do want to add a couple more things to wrap this up. So we want to add an audio stream player 2D so that we can play that sound effect when it's destroyed. And let's go ahead and set up our animations on our animation player. So really, we need 2 animations. One we'll call default, which is basically what we're looking at right now, and then a destroy. So let's just come in here to our animation. We'll say new animation, we'll call it default. Okay. And this is going to be extremely straightforward. The only thing we're going to do on this animation is select our Sprite 2D for our pot and just add a keyframe for the frame. Go ahead and say create. Okay, so there we go. There's our animation. And then let's create our destroy animation. We'll just go here and say duplicate. Okay. And 1 second is fine. We shouldn't need a full second, but that's okay. We're just going to keep it at 1 second. Let's add in here a couple things. We want to play the destroy animation for the pot. We'll also do the sound effect for the destroy. It'll be a pot cracking sound that we brought in, and then we're going to fade out this drop shadow. Okay, so we'll do those. So to start, the first animation here of the Sprite 2D is fine on frame 4. Let's go ahead. It's okay to start there. And I'll just come up to the frame key and just click this. Actually, hold on. I'm going to stop. There's this, the settings have changed on the Snap. I actually looked this up because you've probably heard me complain about it a couple times. I don't really like this interval. It tends to coordinate well, I should say, with if you change this from seconds to frames per second, then it's a 30 frame per second kind of interval that we've got going on here. So in that respect, it makes sense. If any of you know of a way to change this default, let me know. As far as I'm aware right now, I haven't found one, but I'm going to change it to seconds, and I just want it to be 0.025. Actually, let's do this. I want it to be 0.075, I think, actually, for the pot right now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start this again. Come in here, I'm going to click the frame and just keep clicking, and it's going to add those frames until we're out. And I guess I don't need that last one that's empty. That might eventually get filled by another, another thing. But what we can do actually is put a frame here, and I'm just going to I'm going to type 99. Okay, that put it on 47. That's the last frame of that sprite sheet. We can reserve that last frame as a blank frame. That way we know we can always get to blank. Okay, so there's that animation. I'll just play that real quick. Just a nice little crumble animation there. Or, I don't know, decent. And then let's go ahead and modulate this shadow. So we'll go to the beginning of our animation, and I'm going to select the sprite shadow 2D. I'm going to come down to visibility and put a key on the modulate. And then we'll just come to the end here, the last frame of it cracking. It doesn't really need to be very visible at this point. So I'm going to add another key, but we'll go ahead and select this keyframe, select the value, oops, and then just drag the alpha all the way to 0. There we go. So now the shadow will fade out. And you could change that if you want, but I think that's good enough for my intents and purposes. And then lastly, let's put the audio in there. I'm going to add a track, an audio playback track. Here it wants us to pick the node that we're going to use. The audio stream player 2D is what we want to select. We'll say OK. And then there's a couple ways you could do this, but I'm going to go over to the file system and navigate back to my pot folder. And I've got this pot destroy wave. So if we select this and hit play, there we go. It's a little bit of a bit crushed sound effect of some glass breaking. Let's go back. Let's see. Yeah, my animation's good. Okay. So I'm going to just drag this down to the animation and plop it right in here. Okay. So now we've got a sound effect with our pot destroy animation. And let's just set this back to the reset. Made some nice keyframes for reset. That's good. Now at this point, let's go ahead and create that throwable scene that we're going to use, this modular scene, and we can drop it in here once we've kind of created it. But I'm going to go down to my file system, and I don't want to create this in the props folder. This is a decision you can make. I try and design or maybe not design, but place things in a certain organization within my project so that it's easy for me to find. So I consider this an interactable. Okay, so within this interactables folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll just call it throwable. And we'll create a new scene inside this folder. There we go. And then let's just go ahead and right click on the scene throwable. We'll say attach script. We'll call it throwable. That's good. I'll just say create. Okay, so we've got this scene. Now, what does this scene need to have? And what actually, what kind of node does it need to be? So the throwable itself should be an area, because this is going to be an area that when entered will allow the player to interact with it. And then when they leave it, they can't, much like our treasure chests or other things. Okay, so we'll go ahead and I'm going to change this root type. We probably should have done this before we created the script, but it's not that big a deal. So this should be an area 2D. Okay, and then I'm going to save that and open my script. And I'm going to say that this extends area 2D. That way we've got all that functionality tied in there. And while I'm here on the script, let's just give it a class name of throwable. Okay, it extends area 2D. And come back to my scene. Actually, we don't need to do too much else right now with this, because we don't want to assign the collision shape within the scene unless for some reason you know that all throwable objects are going to need the same collision area. Okay, if that's the case, you're welcome to go ahead and just add a collision 2D as a child of this. But if not, I'm going to save this. Let's go to our pot. Let's add an instance of our throwable. Okay, and then we can go ahead and add the collision shape here to the pot. So we'll just add a collision shape 2D and just configure this real quickly. So it'll be a rectangular shape. And I'm going to just click and drag this just slightly larger than the collision shape is fine for me, because our player's got that little collision area that sticks out in front of him and we want him to get right next to the pot. Okay, so we'll do that. I'm going to change the debug color for fun, make it kind of green, and then drag the transparency down. So there we go. That green shape is how close, or the area that will allow the player to interact with it. Okay, let's go back now to our throwable scene. We do need to configure some settings on this area 2D. So let's see, by default, we want the monitoring on, but it's not monitorable. So we'll turn that off. And then let's go ahead and go down to our collision. So it doesn't need to be on any layer. We can turn off mask for layer 1, but we should be looking on the mask for layer 3, which, as you can see with that tooltip, for me is my player interact layer. So I've already configured the player interact area to be on this layer, okay? And then we also decided we wanted this to be able to hurt an enemy when we throw it. So I'm going to add a HurtBox. I'm going to make a confession here. I called my HurtBoxes, and where the player gets hit, I called it a hitbox. And I think I borrowed that. I don't know. To be honest, I was kind of confused when I chose the terms because I can't remember why I was at the time. And I just didn't think about it since then. Somebody pointed out in one of the comments, but this probably should be called a hitbox, but the code works, so I'm sticking with it right now rather than refactor, but you're welcome to try and change that if you want. But this HurtBox now, let's just go ahead and make sure that we configure this appropriately. We're going to do something here. Again, we don't necessarily want to assign the collision shape 2D now, although you could. And I don't think there's a big problem with doing that, but maybe what we'll do in this case, which will be interesting, is we'll write a script that will duplicate whatever collision shape we put in the throwable and assign it to the HurtBox. Okay, so we'll handle it that way. Otherwise, you could go ahead and set up that collision shape how you want. And then another thing is our HurtBox is probably ever only going to do 1 damage, so that default setting is fine. Let's just look at the collision and make sure. See, by default, this is going to hurt the player. We don't want that. So I'm going to turn off the mask for layer 2, which is its default, and turn on layer 9, which is the enemy layer. Okay, that's the layer where he could be hurt. So there we go. Got that configured. And then at this point, we've got this lovely empty scene, and we're ready to start building our script. Okay, the throwable script. What do we need to do here? We're going to have to build this bit by bit because it's going to be one of the more complicated scripts we've built, I think. I mean, not terribly so, but there's a lot of moving pieces with it. So let's start with some export variables that we know we're going to want. First, we're going to want one, and this is something that we haven't really done in this project. I'm going to call this variable gravity strength. So this is going to be, within Godot, and I'll go ahead and show you this real quick. Within our project settings, if we search for a setting for gravity, you can see that the physics have a gravity set up. For 3D, it's 9.8, which, fits with real gravity. If we go to 2D, it's 980. That's just multiplied by 100 because of the scale difference, I guess, if you will. So 980 is the default gravity for a 2D game. And so we could grab that value if we wanted to and just run with that. And I think that would be okay. But then if I just had this thought that if you wanted an object to be something that should fall more slowly, well, then we could just adjust the gravity on it. Okay. I mean, that's obviously not how it works in real life. You don't change the gravity of an object to make it fall slower like a feather. But that's what we're going to do here, because this is a game after all. We can do whatever we want. So the gravity strength by default will just set to 980 because that will feel good for our pot. But this way, you could change it. We're going to have another export variable. This is going to be called throw speed. Okay, so each throwable object, you'll be able to say how fast it gets thrown. This also will be a float. And I'm going to set this to 400. It's going to move pretty quickly. Remember, our player movement speed is probably around 100 if you've been following along. I'm going to export a variable for throw height strength. And, we're dealing with height here, but we only have an X and a Y. So you'll see how we handle that, but we're going to need some variables to help simulate the pot going up and down, okay? So by default, we'll just say it's 100. And again, we're going to export these variables so that per object that's throwable, you could adjust them and get something that feels right for that object, okay? These numbers that I put in happen to be just right for a pot or for a general like heavy object, okay? We'll export one more variable, and this is going to be the throw starting height. Now, you might not need this. I added this because I realized not everybody is building the exact same game. Your character sprite might look different. Your animations might look different. So this is a variable, so you can just determine where it starts. And the reason we're going to export it is because you might actually want to change this per object. I don't know. That's up to you. Okay, so there we go. We've got some export variables, all variables that we can adjust on a per object basis. And then we're going to have some other variables that are just private to the script. We need to track if the object has been picked up. Okay, and by default, we'll set that to false. We're going to have a variable here that we call throwable. And what this is it's going to be a reference to a node. So we'll just assume it's a node 2D because any kind of 2D node extends from node 2D. This is going to end up being a reference to the parent of the throwable object, so we know what is throwable. Now, in this example, right, or in what we're building here, the throwable scene is not actually what we're throwing. It's the scene that it's placed within, and so in this case, it would be this pot. Okay, so we need to grab a reference to whatever this node is so that we can manipulate it as needed. Okay, so let's go back to our throwable script. So that's what we're going to use this throwable variable for. We're also going to want a reference to a few other things. And we'll adjust these in just a minute, but we're going to need some references to some other things. But for now, this should suffice just to get us started. And then I'm going to just, let's go ahead and grab, let's see, let me open up my throwable scene. Let's just grab a reference to our HurtBox because we're obviously going to need to manipulate that. And then with that, let's just create our ready function. Let's go ahead and just do a couple things in here. So first, we're going to say area entered. We know we're going to need to set up area entered and exited conditions. Okay, so we'll connect that signal to, we'll just create a function on area entered, or we'll say on area enter maybe. Okay, and I'm going to just copy that, and we'll just create an empty function for now. You know, this area entered signal does emit with a value of whatever the area is that entered. So we'll just make sure we indicate that here. Okay, and I'll say pass so that we can just ignore the actual function for the time being. And we'll have an on area exit as well. Okay, and let's connect to that one. So we've got area entered, and then we'll have area exited dot connect. And then we'll just pass or connect that to our on area exit function. Okay, just like that. So we've got our signals connected, so we'll be able to begin making it interactive. Let's go ahead and, we set up this throwable variable. Let's go ahead and assign that here. So we'll say throwable equals get parent, because that's really all we need to do. Should be good just with that. And then we want to configure the HurtBox. So by default, we don't want the HurtBox working. Otherwise, if an enemy walked up to the pot, they'd get hurt. So let's do this. For our HurtBox, let's create a function. I'm going to call it setup HurtBox. Simple as that. Okay. And I'm actually going to define this function down at the bottom of my code. And the first thing this needs to do, actually all we really need to do at this step is just set the monitoring to false. But we also need to remember I said we were going to get the collision shape from our throwable and make a new one for the HurtBox. So we're going to do this here. We'll say for C and get children. We'll just check. We're just going to go through the children, and we'll say if C is collision shape, because we should have one. Yeah, collision shape 2D, right? That's what we need. So once we find one of those, or if we find one of those, then we're going to just make a new collision shape out of it. So we'll say variable, we'll call this underscore COL, and it should be a collision shape 2D, is going to be equal to C that we found dot duplicate. So there's this duplicate function in here, and it's just going to create a copy of that node with all of its settings. And then we can come in here to our HurtBox, and we can say add child, and just add this new collision shape 2D that we've created or duplicated. And then, well, I guess that's it. If you wanted to, in my code, I added a debug color. So let's do that just for fun. That way, if we turn debugging on, it'll have a different color. So the debug color we should make it red. So I'm just going to go 1001. Okay. Or that could be like 0.5 maybe. Okay. That's the alpha at the end there. So we just give it a debug color. That's not ultra critical. You don't necessarily need that in your code. But if you want to be able to see it for debugging purposes, then that line will help out. Okay, now let's set up our on area and on area enter and on area exit functions, because they're pretty straightforward. All we really need to do in this case is connect to the player interact signals that we've got on our player manager. So again, if you recall from previous videos, or if you're new to this one and you haven't been following along, we have a player manager that it has an interact pressed signal. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just connect to that. And we're going to have a function we'll just call player interact. Okay, copy that, just paste it right up here. And as a refresher, this player manager, see, it's got this signal up here, interact pressed. And it just emits, let's see, let's find it in the code real quick. We have a function in here called emit interact pressed, which actually is new. This didn't exist previously, but we need to add it today. And the reason, I'm not sure when this was added. I just don't know if it was in the original code. And I apologize for that if there's confusion, but I'm highlighting it now so that if you're following along and you don't have an emit interact pressed, then go ahead and add that to your code. Okay. But really all it is when the player presses the interact button, it just emits this signal depending on if you're in a state that it allows for interaction. So the idle state will call this and emit this signal, and then so will, I think, walking state. Okay, so probably just in two places the player can do that. And then any interactable object can just listen to that. You know, once the areas connect and overlap, then we're going to connect to that signal, listen to it, and respond if they press it. And then if the player leaves, which is what will happen on area exit, then we just disconnect from that signal. So we no longer respond if the player presses interact. Okay, so we'll just copy and paste that and change this to disconnect. So we disconnect this method from this signal. Okay, so let's work just a little bit on this player interact function. I want to do something in here because we kind of need to do a couple things, right? Because when the player comes up to the pot and picks it up, then I imagine if they press the interact button again, they would probably throw the object, right? So we need to respond differently depending if the player's holding it or not. And so we have a Boolean for that, right? So we can say if picked up equals false or true, we could do certain things. I'm going to say false in this case. So if it hasn't been picked up, then we'll pick it up here, okay? So we'll say, pick up throwable object. And then in the future, we're going to need to do a little bit extra here. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, we're going to run into a bug. I'm going to intentionally leave this out so that we can demonstrate the bug. But we're going to have an issue because what if you've got like two pots that are really close to each other and the player's standing in between them and presses pick up? What's going to happen is he's going to pick up both the pots, but one of them's going to get picked up properly, the other one's not. But it's going to cause some issues, right? So here we need to pick up one pot only. Or this could also apply to other interactable objects, okay? So as you see fit, this fix that we put in place for picking up a pot is something that could have broader implications and require slightly broader solution. But we'll address, for these throwable objects, we'll address how to only get one at a time, and we'll do that first, okay? And then otherwise, if we haven't picked it up, we'll pick it up, and so on. So let's just do this. Let's start with something very simple. Once we pick up the pot, let's just print a message to start and just see if we are connecting these signals. And in fact, I'm not going to say pot picked up, I'll say pick up pot. And then if we run our example scene here, let me just scoot this off to the side. We should see a message when I try and interact with it. Oh my gosh. Okay. I've hit every button but interact. Pick up pot. Okay. And we can just keep hitting that. You can see as I hit it, it just keeps spamming the console. That's good that we see that because that means that we've gotten this far in the process and things are working, okay? We obviously are going to have to come back to this, but now we've hit a part of this particular tutorial where it gets the most complex the quickest, because now we got to handle multiple things. how are we going to pick up the pot? How are we going to attach it to the player? We got to build the player animations to support that. And I don't know, just a couple things around those, right? Like those two things alone are kind of tricky. Okay. So that's what we're gonna start now, focusing a little bit more on the player, and then we'll come back to this throwable script and we'll try and tie it all together. All right, so in order to handle the player piece of this, let's just make sure you've got your player scene open. Go ahead and open that and find that. Not only do we need to create these animations, right, but obviously our player is built using this a state machine that we've created. Okay, so we're going to need to create states, and I've decided to break this into two states. There's a state for picking up the pot, and then there's a state for carrying the pot. And this is a complicated enough thing that I imagine there was going to be some bugs with this after I finished this tutorial, but I've worked through some of the ones that I found in the process of developing it. So I hope you don't see that as me not being careful. It's just the nature of development. And I think that's why a lot of people don't do these long running series like this, because, you know, you're going to put out code that's not maybe 100% ready to deploy. But what I think is beneficial about doing this is then you understand that this is just part of the development process that everybody goes through. And it's normal to have bugs. Having bugs doesn't mean you're bad at developing or you don't know how to make games. It just means you're just working through the process, right? So with that preface, let's go ahead and just work on the player animations real quick. This is the easiest thing to set up with the player. So we should have, you know, we talked about making sure we bring over the new player sprite sheet, which you should have done in a previous video or at the beginning of this video. But we're going to create animations for lifting and for carrying an object. I don't have one for throwing an object. Didn't seem that important to me. But you could add one pretty easily to the end of one of these states and it wouldn't require too much work. Okay. Most of the work would be in animating, I think. Another thing that we want to address as we build these animations is actually really critical. Okay. We need to, because we've mentioned this problem of how do we make the pot a part of the player? And there's probably a lot of ways to handle this. I think the simplest and the most intuitive way to handle this, especially when it comes to animations, is for us to create a node within our player that is where held objects will live. And what we can do is we can remove that object from this level scene and make it a child of the player scene with this node within the player scene, and then it'll just follow the player around without any extra code. Okay, so we're going to do that. And then we can also animate the position of that node to animate the object that the player is carrying. So as he walks, as he's lifting it, we'll just animate the node. And all we have to do is put the node as a child of it, and it will become animated with the player. Okay, so let's go ahead and start there. And there's probably a little bit more to explain with that, but that's just going to be a child of our Sprite 2D. Okay, it's going to be a child of the Sprite 2D specifically so that it works when the player's flipped left or right. If you didn't have it flipping left or right, you might be able to get away with just making it a child of player, but it's not how we built this one. So here's our Sprite 2D. I'm going to rename it. Why did I call the Sprite 2D? I don't want a Sprite 2D. Okay, so let's add this child for Sprite 2D. It just needs to be a node 2D. And I'm going to rename it to, I'm going to call it HeldItem. You might have a better name for that, but that's what I'm calling it. And then for now, let's pretend like we need to add an object. I want to be able to see what this is going to look like. So I'm going to do Shift-Control-A, and I'm actually just going to grab a pot. Actually, I don't want the whole scene. There's too much going on there. Let me just add a Sprite 2D. Let's do that. In fact, we could just copy it, couldn't we, from our pot? Let's go to Sprite 2D, copy, come over to our HeldItem, and just paste that. Okay, there we go. So there's a pot. So now this HeldItem, you can see wherever we move it, the pot will follow. Makes sense. And then we'll be able to animate its position. Okay, so we've got that in there. And let's go ahead and create our animations at this point. So come down and find your primary animation player on the player node or within the player scene. And I'm going to actually pick an animation. I don't know. Any animation will probably do. I'm going to just duplicate the idle because right now I just need to start with the player frames. So let's duplicate this. and I'll call it lift underscore down. I hope I don't try and call it different things. Pick up, lift. Anyways, I'm going to call this animation lift underscore down. Okay, and then the lift frames are quite simple. We can, if we leave this on continuous, and I'm just going to adjust the duration of this animation to about 0.3 and turn off the looping because I duplicated an animation with looping. Okay, just drag this keyframe in here to the end. So the beginning frame for this is going to be frame 33 for the down. And for just a moment, I'm going to hide this sprite. Okay, so you can see this. Oh gosh, he's going all over the place. Okay, for the first frame, he's down, picking up. And then the last frame, it's only a couple frames long, the animation. So this one we'll say is frame 35. Okay, so now when we play this, he does this pickup animation, quite simple. It's nice how effective it can be with just 3 frames. And then now all we need to really animate is the held item. Okay, so let's just put our playhead at the beginning of this animation, select the held item node. And now we need to decide where to place this. So I'm going to drag this down to roughly where I think it should be. And let's look at the transform. That's X, on the X coordinate, that's 0. And on the Y coordinate, that's 20 pixels. Okay, that's like right here at the bottom of the ground, which I think is the spot we want it. Okay, and in fact, if I turn on, you can see now when I turn on the sprite, you can see where that is in relation to the player. So let's go ahead and select our held item. Let's key that position, keyframe. Okay, and then because this animation is continuous on the frames, this is not an exact science as it maybe could be, but we're just going to go to like 0.1 seconds here. We'll create a new key. And in this situation, if we hide the sprite, you can see that the player is kind of midway picking it up. Okay, so we'll just grab this and bring it up somewhere right about here, maybe. Okay, so it's lifting up here. We'll set this to, okay, let's set this to like maybe 10. Okay, I think that's where about that is. And then another thing we can do is, you see how the pot's like animating without the player? We don't want continuous frames down here. We're going to put these to discrete. And in fact, you know what? It might be safe here to make this discrete. So we can go, so that way we can control it. Let's put a new keyframe in here for the lift, and we'll just set this to 34. Okay, so we've still got our lift keyframes. Now it will be an exact science. So ignore my comment earlier about since this one's continuous. Okay. Okay, so he's picking up the item, and then at the last frame, we'll insert one more keyframe. And this value is going to be -16, I think. Let's just wobble that. Okay, there we go. So you can see it's kind of sitting on top of his hands. There we go. Now we've got this animation, goes from down to up. I'm going to just drag both of these frames maybe in a notch or two. We've got our funny snapping here. 0.05 is my favorite. Okay. Where are these keyframes at? Okay, 0.1, that's good. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. We want to keyframe one other thing though, because I want to show you something. So in the case of our pot, like we want the pot to be able to sometimes be behind the player. And in fact, let's do this. Let's create our lift up. So I'm going to go ahead and just say duplicate the lift down, and we'll change this to lift up. Now, if we change the frames for our lift up, right, we're going to, that's going to start at frame 36. So it's going to be 36, 37, and 38. So I'll just update these real quick. Okay, so now this animation, he's facing the other way. Let's go ahead and hide the sprite so we can see that. Okay. But we've got a problem because we don't want the sprite to be, we don't want the pot to be in front of the player. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here to our held item, and under visibility, we're going to check show behind parent. If we do that for this animation, it looks just fine, right? But so that show behind parent is a pretty critical value. I'm going to go ahead and keyframe that here on the lift up animation. So when we're lifting, when we're facing the up direction, we want this to be set to show behind. I'm going to go ahead and say edit. I'm going to copy tracks. I'm going to copy that show behind parent value. Let's go back to our lift down and let's paste this. But in this case, this track needs to be turned or this value needs to be turned off on this track, right? So that it's in front. Okay, so now we've got this built in so that the pot can be in front or behind the player, or whatever the object is. Okay, go ahead and save that. Let's go back to our lift up, because the lift down now is complete. The lift up is okay. It just doesn't look 100% how I would want it to look, I don't think. So for example, on this frame, I think it should just be a little bit higher, maybe. I'm going to try -20 and see what that looks like. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too high. Let's try -18. I think it was -16 before, right? Okay, that looks a little bit better. These other frames aren't too critical, but honestly, this one should be. If that was, or sorry, if that was on 20, if that was on 20, then maybe it needs to be like on 18. So it's just a little bit higher. Okay. In fact, I'm gonna go like 17 on that one. You know, we kind of have to estimate. We kind of have to estimate where this held item is going to be. So actually, I'm going to drag it up a little bit. We can't even really see it, but I'm going to guess that it's going to be, the bottom of it's going to be right about here if we're below it. So maybe 14's a better value. Okay, so let me just select that. We'll say 14. And then this middle one is not super critical, but obviously we need to adjust it, right? Let's just set this to 0, because that's somewhere in here. Okay, so that's, because this object isn't seen much when you're lifting it, this is a little bit less critical, but with that, you can see that you can kind of see the pot right there as he lifts it. Boink. Okay. So we've got our lift up. We've got our lift down. Let's go ahead and just duplicate this one more time for our side. And set that up really quick. So this lift side keyframes are going to be, let's see, 39, what, 39 to 41, 39, 40, and 41. Okay. And then this one gets a little bit interesting, because now the pot, not only do we have to move the position a little bit differently, but it needs to be kind of over here, right? So it's going to animate a little bit more drastically than the others. So I've kind of played around with this. So if we put this on the X value of about 16, and then we can drop it down again. I can't remember where we had that about. No, 22 is too far. Where did we have that at before? 20? So on this first frame, if it's about there, okay, that looks okay. Obviously, on the second keyframe, it needs to still be out. Probably the same value on the X. So let's just say like 16. Is that what we put it on? Yeah. Bonk. Well, that's not looking quite right, is it? Oh, I guess I didn't see this after we placed it. So this second keyframe is, I guess it needs to come in. Let's just do this. Let's just grab our held item. Let's come in here and let's say, okay, it needs to be about there. And then we can just click on the key. Okay, there we go. We've got our held item. And on this one, I do want it to show behind. You can kind of choose behind or in front. I think it's just kind of up to you. I prefer how it looks when we're showing the picked up item behind the player sprite, even though it's behind his head. Everything else about it I prefer. Okay, so there we go. We've got our lifting animations. And next we can take these concepts and apply it to the carrying animation. So we've got, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and actually, and we're going to need to keyframe these same things. So if we just find our lift down and duplicate this animation, then we can call this carry _ down. And our show behind is good. We only need this last keyframe of the position here. And in fact, we just need this last keyframe of the lift animation as well. Okay, so we're going to have two versions of the carry animation. We're going to have carry and carry walking. So carry is just when you're standing still. Okay, or we could call this one carry idle. I don't know. It's up to you. I'm going to just call it carry. Okay, so there's that. That's actually really easy. Let's go ahead and instead of duplicating the carry down, let's select our lift up. And we'll duplicate this one. And we'll call it carry up. Okay, and then again, we'll just do the same thing. We'll just take these keyframes over here and just delete those and drag these guys. Okay, so that's what it looks like there. And Let's find our lift side and do this one more time. We'll duplicate that and call it carry side. Delete these frames that we don't need and just set this up. Okay. Okay, so now we've got a new set of animations. Coming along pretty quick there. Let's go ahead and duplicate our carry down now, and let's create the carry walk. Now, this animation is slightly more complicated. 0.3 is the appropriate amount of time for this. Let's go ahead and change our animation looping to the ping pong, because you know how I've built these frames is they ping pong for the walk. If yours is different, do what you need to. So there's only a few frames for this. So let me just grab this first frame. The first frame of the walking down animation is actually 42. Okay, you can see his foot there. And then what we can do is just select that. And then if we have our snap set to 0.05, this is going to work out just great. Okay, so let's come up here to our sprite. We'll just click this key a couple times. Oh man, I did not. Oh, I didn't want it to snap to 0.05. I wanted to snap to 0.1. That's okay. Let's just go ahead and drag these out like so. Okay, so now we've got a walking animation. We do want to animate this pot as well so that it kind of bobs. I mean, the position, let's stop this here. So the first frame, I think, oh boy, let me compare that. This one we actually need to drop down, but this initial frame is good here, right? The 16 pixels. I'm going to copy and paste that on these two frames. What did I copy and paste? I want to copy that and paste it. Okay, there we go. So we've got our pot up there, but then at the beginning, this first frame, we actually need it to be -15. And I'm going to copy that frame and come to the end of the animation and paste it. So that way the pot bobs up and down with the player as he walks. Okay, pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and for the sake of getting the correct position on our held item, I'm going to take our carry up animation and duplicate that for the carry walk up. You know, normally we might duplicate the walking one. Now this carry walk up begins on frame 30 or frame 46. Let me change my snap to 0.1. Come here to my sprite. 46. It's not updating. There we go. You just got to drag that playhead sometimes to get that value to update. And then we'll just key this a couple times. Okay. And again, set this to ping pong. Let's play the animation. The walking part of the animation itself looks good. We just need to move the pot. So we're going to do the same thing. This keyframe with the pot up high belongs kind of on the center 2 frames. And then on the first frame, we'll just set this to -17, I suppose. Copy that. Paste it. You know, I don't know. Where did I copy and paste again? I don't know where my focus was. Okay, there we go. Now our pot's moving up and down with the player. Just put those keyframes at the beginning and the end at -17 and leave the middle ones at -18. And then last but not least, we just need to go, I guess, to our carry side animation. Duplicate this. Make it a carry walk side. Okay, and then let's see. Carry walk side begins at frame 50. And then we'll select our sprite, plop these in there. I didn't adjust my snapping again, but you can just drag them pretty quick. Okay. Just move this over here. Copy, paste, paste. Drop one down from -18 to -17. Copy that, paste it there. There we go. Oh, set our looping. And we've got now our carry animations. And I think we're good to go. All right, this is the end of part 1 of this tutorial. It's pretty long, so I split it into 2 videos so that I could kind of get one piece out and continue finishing the other. So go ahead and just keep a lookout. Part 2 will be coming very shortly. And if by the time I get it done, it'll be linked here in this video. And thank you for following along. Please make sure you comment and like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet, and if you want to see what's coming up next. And as always, we'll see you next time.